Hello again, and welcome back to the Richard and Judy Book Club, exclusive to W.H. Smith. This is the next book on our spring 2012 list. It's called The Story of Beautiful Girl, and it's written by Rachel Simon. It's quite an extraordinary novel, really. It's incredibly moving and compelling and beautifully told. But what makes it extraordinary, I think, is the fact that Rachel Simon, the author, has a strong personal investment in the subject matter. It's set in 1968 in Middle America somewhere, and in those days, people who had any kind of developmental disability, what we call learning difficulties or something these days, they used to be put into horrible sounding institutions. They were called institutions for the feeble-minded. Now, at the beginning of this book, a young woman called Linny, who is in one of those institutions, manages to escape together with her lover, who is a black American deaf man. And they run away, and she has a baby. And they eventually, his baby obviously, and they eventually end up in a Midwestern town in America, taking shelter with a retired schoolmistress, a widow, Martha, who takes pity on them. They're caught. She has to go back. She's taken back to the institute. He runs away. But the baby stays with Martha, and Linny says to her, "Please look after her and don't tell anyone." What follows is the most amazing, compelling and wonderful story.
What really struck me reading this book, although it is, as Judy said, set in America, when I was a newspaper reporter just after this period in the very early 70s and went to what we called the mental hospital to do a report, and the conditions were very similar to what she describes here. It is amazing how things have changed and how bad they were in living memory, almost Victorian. It's a testament to how things have changed, this book, and it's beautifully written, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And Rachel's personal investment in the story, which I mentioned earlier, is the fact that her own sister has what's called an intellectual disability. So she knows all about it, and she has very strong opinions about it. Anyway, sadly, Rachel couldn't be here with us today, but we asked her a few questions back home in America.
Well, it was essential to start it back in 1968 because in America, we for 150 years have had two systems of institutions in this country, institutions for people with psychiatric issues, which is what most people think about, but we've also had a system for people with what is now called intellectual and developmental disabilities, and that would include autism, what used to be called mental retardation, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, things like that. That's the kind of place that I'm writing about. They were at their peak in 1969, so setting it a year earlier made a lot of sense. And by their peak, I mean that we had almost 250,000 people living in them just because they had a diagnosis of a disability, a mental disability, or an intellectual or developmental disability, and because we didn't provide services for them in this country. So it was this crime that was happening on a very large scale. It was in every state in the country. There were 283 of them at that time. And it was only after the peak and the exposés that started, which I do cover in the book, that they began to realize, well, maybe we shouldn't be having these places, and slowly people started getting moved into the community. So starting it at that moment, it's sort of like, if you're going to start about the war that we had in the States or the colonies with England, you really have to start it at a specific moment in history to be able to do the story justice, and that was the moment in history to start this story. It is a question that I can't answer in a universal way, because I think one of the things that I know as a sibling of a person with a disability is that each person with a disability is just that person with a disability, just as if I'm just one person with curly hair. There's a lot of people with curly hair, or you're just one person wearing a pair of eyeglasses. So I think it really is a matter of how capable is that person? What are the supports that individual has? Is that individual receiving assistance from the government or some other resource to be able to provide for that child? What's the whole context of that person's life? And I think it really needs to be looked at that way rather than blanket statements being made. To do so is to say, oh, no one with a mental disability should be able to have a child. That's discriminatory and it's unjust. I'd like to think I would do what Martha did. I think really Martha is the character in the book most like me. I love all the characters very much, but Martha is the first character in the story. She's the person you enter the book with, and she's the person I entered the book with. And I had recently lost a job teaching when the department restructured me out, and that is why she is a retired school teacher and is in touch with her former students as I was. Also, when I started writing the book, I had been married for, how many years? 6 years. I'd married later in life to someone who did not want children. And at the time when we married, I was ambivalent about having children, so I agreed that I would put the ambivalence aside and go with his desire not to have children, and then went into a grieving period about having made that choice. And I was still at the tail end of that when I lost my job, and my students were really the only younger people I was in touch with. So I was very much like Martha, although grieving something else. I was grieving the loss of the job and not having had children. And so to have a child suddenly deposited in her life, I suppose in some ways it was almost a very distant fantasy that I had, and I learned how to raise that child through helping Martha figure out how she would raise that child. My sister Beth, who has an intellectual disability, there is nothing in my life. Every breath I take is connected to my sister. Part of that is we're so close in age. She's only 11 months younger than I am, so we've always been twins, 1 month a year twins. I think about her all the time. There was a period when we had friction, and I ended up writing another book about that and how we repaired our relationship. That was called Riding the Bus with My Sister. In terms of this book, everything about this book, every word comes through me, and because I am who I am, because I have a sister with this disability and I love her, and her life matters to me, every word in this book is steeped in a tea that is made of 2 tea bags, and one is Rachel and one is Beth.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Rachel. Just to remind you, it's The Story of Beautiful Girl by the lady you've just been seen talking, Rachel Simon. That was very interesting, Rachel. Thank you very much indeed. And the book is terrific.
It's great. And once you've read it, do come back to the website, whsmith.co.uk/Richard and Judy, and write your own review if you've got the time. It can be as long or as short as you like. We really do. We always say this, but we really do enjoy reading what you think and sort of crossing swords a bit, because sometimes we disagree. So once you've read it, post your review here.